I would like to say that I'm fully confident that in the end my husband wrote wingless kids. My entire life I was called a sex symbol, but no one ever prepared me for having to lie beside men who collapsed faster than their own legends. Marilyn Monroe said this very late in her life in a private conversation at a time when fame had already frozen into a monument. Back then, the world still believed she was the most desired woman on the planet, the chosen one, the pursued one, the woman placed in the beds of names whose power and prestige made all of Hollywood bow its head. But Marilyn wrote that the men who passed through her life were not merely lovers. They were symbols constructed by a system to represent masculinity, strength, and power. And for that very reason, they carried a particular kind of violence. Some poured their wildness onto her and called it art. Some turned intimacy into a cold transaction where her feelings had no right to speak. Others didn't need to lay a hand on her at all. They only had to make her believe she should be grateful just to be there. This is Marilyn Monroe's belated revelation about powerful men who lacked humanity. Men who entered her life wrapped in dazzling glory and left behind emotional and physical experiences that were hollow, brutal, and destructive. Press like not to elevate another legend, but to acknowledge that it is finally time for the truth to be spoken from the side of the one who was silent for far too long. Tony Curtis in bed, I was just a prop in his act of self-worship. In 1958, on the white sands of the Hotel del Coronado, Some Like It Hot was filmed like an endless party. The camera loved the California sun. The press loved the smiles. And the public loved the idea that Marilyn Monroe and Tony Curtis were the perfect couple. Two radiant stars standing side by side, beautiful enough to render everything else irrelevant. But behind the lens, Marilyn was unraveling. She struggled with lines, with sleepless nights, with the feeling that she was slowly slipping out of her own body. In that emptiness, she sought comfort in the nearest presence. Tony Curtis polished, elegant, flawless, to the point of leaving no room for error. I thought his perfection would make me feel safe, until I realized I was lying next to a mirror. To the public, Tony was the impeccable gentleman. On set, he behaved properly, delivered charm, in measured doses, kept a safe distance. But once the door closed, Marilyn began to see another truth. Tony did not love other people. He loved himself. Intimacy with Tony was not a meeting of two humans. It was a carefully staged ritual where everything was so clean, it felt sterile. No sweat, no disorder, no emotions spilling over. Marilyn wrote that Tony was obsessed with cleanliness, as though it were the final barrier protecting him from having to feel anything at all. He touched me the way one touches a surface, carefully, precisely, and completely absent. The most painful part was not the coldness of his body. It was his eyes. Marilyn confessed that in the moments that should have been most intimate, Tony did not look at her. He looked at the mirror across the room. He adjusted his hair. He studied his own face. He made sure the reflection remained perfect, even while lying beside the woman the entire world desired. There, Marilyn was not the object of desire. She was a prop, an accessory required to complete Tony Curtis's performance of self-adoration. Later, when Tony told the press that kissing Marilyn was like kissing Hitler, Hollywood laughed and believed him. The remark was treated as witty, blunt, even brave. And Marilyn, as always, was cast into her familiar role: difficult, unstable, unprofessional. I was labeled the problem, so no one had to ask why he needed to humiliate me that way. Marilyn's diary tells a different story. She wrote that Tony's cruelty did not stem from disappointment, but from envy. Every time they entered a room, all eyes turned to Marilyn. And Tony could not endure standing in her shadow. He could not forgive the fact that she radiated naturally while he had to labor endlessly to maintain his perfect image. In the bedroom, he punished her with coldness, with distance, by making her feel dirty simply for being touched, as if her vulnerability itself contaminated his perfection. He made me feel like something that needed to be wiped clean, not someone who needed to be held. Tony Curtis's tragedy was not cruelty. It was emptiness. A man who only existed when there was a mirror to reflect him, who only felt safe when everything confirmed the image he wanted to see. Hollywood loves that kind of man, beautiful, smooth, inoffensive, as long as no one looks too closely. And Marilyn, standing beside him, learned a bitter truth. Perfection can hide many things, but it cannot create presence. Tony Curtis represented the most glamorous side of Hollywood, where everything shines, everything is spotless, and everything is hollow inside. Marlon Brando, I knew I was nothing more than a place for him to unload his darkest desires. There was a time in Hollywood when merely mentioning the name Marlon Brando caused a room to lower its voice. Not because he spoke loudly, but because people believed he carried something heavier than words, something called truth. Brando didn't need to be handsome. He didn't need polish. He only needed to appear. And the world convinced itself that here was a man who didn't act but lived straight from instinct. For Marilyn Monroe, that was especially dangerous. She was already exhausted from being seen as a surface, accustomed to men who noticed her body before they noticed her humanity. Brando, to her, seemed like the perfect opposite, dark, complex, withdrawn, a man celebrated as the only one in Hollywood who didn't care that Marilyn was a sex symbol. She believed that with him she wouldn't have to perform. I thought I was touching the depth of an artist until I realized he was simply avoiding the effort of being a decent human being. The moment Marilyn stepped into Brando's private space, the first thing she noticed was not emotion, but smell. Not cologne, not fresh cigarettes, but neglect. Old food, cold smoke, and an unwashed body. Brando's apartment didn't feel like the dwelling of a tormented artist. It felt deliberately unkept, like a manifesto. Marilyn quickly understood that for Brando, filth was not an accident. It was a stance. He treated the rejection of hygiene, courtesy, and all forms of making things pleasant as proof of authenticity. Bathing was artificial. Cleanliness was dishonest. Caring about another person's feelings was weakness. In Brando's world, a real man had to live like an animal, and anyone beside him had to accept that as art. Marilyn tried to accept it, but intimacy was where the illusion collapsed. There was no seduction, no gradual closeness, no sense of being chosen. Marilyn was not invited, she was pulled in. He called his wildness real, while I lay there wondering when my feelings had become irrelevant. Sex with Brando did not feel like an encounter. It felt like a collision, a physical brawl in which he discharged tension, anger, and frustration. Marilyn didn't remember whispers. She remembered force. She remembered rough hands. She remembered feeling like an object used for release, not a person.